1990 year, Baghdad. Muhammad Ali stepped off the plane into the scorching heat. This was not a tour or a show. Iraq had captured 15 Americans, turning them into human shields. The White House was in a rage, diplomats were powerless, and the Pentagon was preparing a missile strike. The whole world saw Ali. He could barely walk, his hands shaking from Parkinson's. The American press called it suicide. He was heading to the palace of Saddam Hussein, a man who did not forgive mistakes. Without guards, without weapons, just one-on-one with the dictator. The blistering Iraqi sun beat down on the tarmac with a relentless intensity that seemed to vibrate against the metal skin of the aircraft. Ali descended the stairs with a slow, agonizing deliberation, each movement a testament to his fading physical coordination but unyielding spirit. The air was thick with the scent of jet fuel and the dry, dusty breath of the desert, a far cry from the cheering arenas of his youth. There were no cameras flashing for a press conference and no fans chanting his name, only the grim, silent observation of armed soldiers whose loyalties lay with a regime currently holding the world at ransom. The gravity of the situation pressed upon him more heavily than the atmospheric heat. He was a man trapped in a body that was betrayed by its own nerves. Yet he was moving toward a confrontation that required the ultimate poise. Every tremor in his hands told a story of a long-fought battle with an invisible enemy. But as he reached the ground, his eyes remained fixed on the horizon, where the sprawling city of Baghdad lay in wait. The political climate was just as volatile as the weather, with international tensions at a breaking point and the threat of catastrophic warfare looming over the entire Middle East. Behind the scenes, high-level officials in Washington watched with a mixture of skepticism and dread, fearing that the presence of such a beloved icon would only complicate the delicate chess game of global security. Ali ignored the whispers of caution and the headlines that painted him as a tragic figure out of his depth. He understood that his fame was a double-edged sword, a tool that could open doors closed to politicians, but also a target that could be used against him. As the black sedan waited to transport him into the heart of the capital, the stark reality of his isolation became clear. He was entering a territory where the rule of law was dictated by a single will, a place where his status as a sports legend provided no physical protection. The drive through the city streets revealed a populace braced for conflict, with military checkpoints and propaganda posters lining the route to the presidential complex. Inside the vehicle, Ali sat in a profound silence, his mind focused on the lives of the 15 men who were being used as bargaining chips in a game of geopolitical brinkmanship. He knew that the coming hours would test his resolve in ways that the boxing ring never could. The palace gates loomed ahead, massive and imposing, a threshold between the known world and the inner sanctum of a totalitarian power. As the car crossed into the grounds, the sounds of the city faded, replaced by the eerie, manicured quiet of the dictator's domain. Ali felt the eyes of the palace guard upon him, their suspicion palpable as they surveyed the man who had come to ask for mercy without offering anything in return but his presence. The engine cut out, and the sudden stillness was jarring. He took a deep breath, steadying his mind as he prepared to step out into the marble halls, where his fate and the fate of the hostages would soon be decided. This was the opening bell of a different kind of fight, one where the stakes were measured in human lives, and the only weapon available was the truth of a man who had nothing left to lose. He stood up, adjusted his suit, and walked toward the entrance, a lone figure of peace in a house built on the foundation of absolute power, Saddam's palace. Ali was forced to wait in a golden cage, hour after hour. The silence was crushing. All around were soldiers with assault rifles, the same men who just yesterday were burning portraits of American stars. Saddam deliberately humiliated the legend, making him feel like a helpless old man. Ali understood that his illness here was his main vulnerability and his main weapon. He did not try to hide the shaking, he froze in prayer. The tension in the room was such that the guards were the first to start getting nervous. The high ceilings of the waiting hall echoed with the rhythmic ticking of a clock that seemed to slow down with every passing minute. a deliberate psychological tactic intended to drain the spirit of anyone who dared to seek an audience with the man in power. The air was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and rosewater, a cloying sweetness that failed to mask the underlying coldness of the stone walls. Ali sat in a massive gilded chair that felt more like a throne of judgment than a seat for a guest, his posture remarkably still despite the tremors that rippled through his limbs. Every time a guard shifted his weight or adjusted the strap of his weapon, the sound cut through the stillness like a gunshot. But Ali did not flinch. He remained centered, his eyes occasionally closing as he recited silent verses, drawing a protective circle of faith around himself that the surrounding hostility could not penetrate. The soldiers watched him with a mixture of confusion and growing unease, unable to reconcile the image of the world's most famous athlete with the frail man sitting before them. They had been prepared for a loud, arrogant American who would demand results, but they were confronted instead with a profound, immovable silence that made their own presence feel intrusive. The light shifted across the marble floor as the sun moved, casting long shadows that looked like the bars of a cell. Yet Ali did not look at his watch or signal for attention. He knew that the dictator was watching through hidden cameras or behind one-way glass, looking for a sign of frustration, a tremor of fear, or a desperate plea for water. By refusing to play the role of the victim, Ali began to dismantle the power dynamic of the room. He leaned into his physical frailty, letting his hands shake openly, turning his disability into a testament of his willingness to suffer for the sake of others. This was not the choreographed drama of a boxing match. It was a war of nerves, where the winner would be the one who could endure the silence the longest. The guards began to avoid his gaze, unsettled by the lack of ego in a man they expected to be full of it. They were men of action, trained to respond to threats, but they had no defense against a man who had completely surrendered his body to a higher purpose. The psychological pressure that was meant to break Ali began to backfire, radiating outward and making the armed men feel like the ones who were truly trapped. The opulence of the palace felt increasingly hollow, a theatrical backdrop that failed to intimidate a man who had already faced the prospect of his own mortality. As the hours bled into the evening, the atmosphere turned electric, the silence no longer a void, but a heavy, pulsating force that demanded a resolution. Ali remained the eye of the storm, his breathing steady and his spirit untouched by the manufactured delays. He was teaching the palace that time did not belong to the dictator, but to the mission of mercy he had come to fulfill. The weight of the 15 lives he came to save was the only thing he allowed to press upon him, a silent anchor that kept him grounded while the regime attempted to float him into a state of panic. Every muscle in his body was exhausted, yet his presence grew larger with every passing moment of neglect, proving that a champion's true strength was never in his fists, but in the patience of his soul. The golden walls seemed to lose their luster in the fading light, leaving only the man and his resolve sitting in the center of the labyrinth, waiting for the inevitable moment when the doors would finally swing open. The doors swung open with a heavy, ominous groan that echoed through the marble hall. Saddam Hussein sat in the shadows of a cavernous office, his figure framed by the cold light of a single desk lamp, watching Ali's entrance like a hunter assessing a prized trophy. The dictator launched an immediate psychological assault, his gaze lingering with calculated cruelty on the champion's trembling hands. He mocked the idea that America had sent a broken fighter to handle a crisis of such magnitude, suggesting that the once mighty athlete was now nothing more than a discarded relic of a failing empire. Saddam leaned forward into the light, reminding Ali of how his own country had stripped him of his titles and threatened him with prison for refusing to fight in Vietnam. It was a deliberate trigger, a sharp needle intended to draw blood and reopen old wounds. The dictator attempted to forge a dark alliance, positioning himself as a fellow revolutionary who understood the sting of American betrayal. The stakes were astronomical, reaching far beyond the walls of the palace. If Ali played along with the dictator's propaganda to win the release of the hostages, he would return home to be branded a traitor and a puppet of a tyrant. If he reacted with anger or arrogance, the fragile bridge of communication would shatter, and the 15 innocent men would likely face execution before the sun set. Ali stood in the center of the room, his physical instability contrasting sharply with the predator's stillness of the man behind the desk. He felt the weight of the cameras hidden in the walls and the invisible eyes of millions watching from across the ocean. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and the metallic tang of absolute authority. Saddam spoke of shared enemies and the hypocrisy of Western democracy, his voice a low, rhythmic drone designed to lull the champion into a sense of false brotherhood. Every word was a trap, every pause a test of the boxer's legendary ego. Ali did not interrupt the monologue, nor did he allow his face to show the inner turmoil of a man caught between his personal safety and his moral obligation. He drew on the lessons of 1,000 rounds in the ring, realizing that this was the ultimate rope-a-dope, a battle where he had to absorb the blows of a tyrant without losing his soul. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, filled with the ghosts of those who had stood in this same spot and failed to find the right path. The dictator's smugness grew as he waited for a response, convinced that he had successfully backed the greatest into a corner from which there was no escape. He offered Ali a chance to speak against the coming war, to condemn the very nation that had once turned its back on him. The silence that followed was the heaviest of Ali's life, a vacuum of sound where the only heartbeat he could hear was his own, steady and rhythmic against the chaos of the world outside. He understood that his response would define not just his legacy, but the survival of the families waiting for news in the United States. He looked past the uniforms and the gold leaf, searching for a flicker of humanity in the eyes of a man who believed he was a god. The physical tremors in his arms intensified, but his gaze remained locked on Saddam's face, an unwavering stare that refused to acknowledge the dictator's perceived superiority. In this high-stakes theater of the mind, Ali was no longer a guest. He was a mirror, reflecting the darkness of the regime back at itself, while searching for a crack in the armor where a single word of truth might take root. The entire room felt like it was suspended over an abyss, waiting for the champion to make a move that could either light a fuse or extinguish a flame. The tension reached a breaking point as the dictator tilted his head, a gesture of impatient curiosity, demanding that Ali finally choose a side in a war that had not yet begun. Ali took a single, difficult step closer to the desk, bringing his shaking hands into the light, and prepared to deliver a counterpunch that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with the strength of a spirit that could not be bought, broken, or turned. Ali seized the initiative with a quiet intensity that shifted the very gravity of the room. He did not engage in a debate over borders or oil or the complex machinery of international politics. Instead, he struck at the only vulnerability that truly mattered to a man in the dictator's position: his legacy. Ali made it clear to Saddam that holding innocent workers captive was not an act of strength, but a confession of fear. He argued that a truly powerful man could afford to be merciful, suggesting that the ultimate proof of authority lay in the ability to grant freedom when it was least expected. He placed Saddam before a stark, historical crossroads. He could choose to be remembered as a petty kidnapper of civilians, a footnote of cruelty in the annals of history, or he could rise as a global leader who showed a grand gesture of goodwill to the greatest athlete the world had ever known. A dead silence fell over the hall, heavy and suffocating like the desert heat outside. Saddam's generals stood like statues, their hands hovering near their holstered sidearms, waiting for a single nod that would signal the end of the meeting and the arrest of the man who dared to speak such truths. The atmosphere was charged with a volatile energy as the champion stood his ground, his body trembling, but his spirit anchored by an unwavering conviction. He watched the flicker of calculation in the dictator's eyes, knowing that he had bypassed the armor of the state to reach the vanity of the man. The tick of the wall clock was the only sound in the vacuum of the palace, each second stretching the tension to its absolute breaking point. Ali leaned into the silence, refusing to retreat or fill the air with desperate pleas. He had delivered his blow not with a closed fist, but with a mirror, forcing the ruler to look at the reflection of his own future. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to pulse with the weight of the decision being made, as the guards looked between the aging fighter and their undisputed master. It was a gamble of unprecedented scale, a test of whether the desire for immortality through a positive legacy could outweigh the immediate utility of political leverage. Ali's presence filled the space, his physical frailty becoming a testament to the moral weight of his words. He was no longer just a visitor from a hostile nation, he was a witness to the humanity that Saddam was on the verge of discarding. The silence continued to hang in the air, thick and impenetrable, as the generals tightened their grip on their resolve, expecting an outburst of rage. Yet, the expected storm did not break. Instead, the focus of the entire room remained fixed on the two men at its center, a champion of the ring and a master of a nation, locked in a silent struggle over the meaning of power. The world beyond the palace walls felt a lifetime away as the final echoes of Ali's challenge settled into the gold and marble, leaving the dictator to grapple with the realization that his place in history was being written in that very moment. Ali did not blink, his gaze steady even as his hands continued their involuntary dance, embodying a courage that did not require a voice to be heard. The tension reached a peak where it seemed the very walls might crack, as every soul in the room realized that the fate of the 15 hostages, and perhaps the course of the coming conflict, now rested on whether the man in the chair valued his ego more than his soul. The transition from the boxer's words to the dictator's response was a void of time that felt like an eternity, a space where the destiny of the innocent was suspended by a single, fragile thread of human choice. Ali waited, a lone figure of peace in the heart of a war machine, having said everything that needed to be said to a man who had never been told the truth in such a way before. Saddam made an unpredictable move by allowing Ali to see the hostages. They were led out of their cells, exhausted, broken people who no longer hoped to see the light. When they saw Ali's trembling silhouette in the gloom, they could not believe their eyes. Ali realized that he could no longer leave alone. This was the point of no return. He gave them his word. Either they would fly away together, or he would stay here. Saddam watched this through the monitors, seeing a sincerity that could not be bought. The air in the lower levels of the complex was cold and smelled of damp concrete and stagnant fear, a sharp contrast to the gilded opulence of the halls above. The hostages moved with the hesitant, dragging steps of men who had forgotten the feeling of open space, their eyes squinting against the dim yellow glow of the corridor lights. They were engineers and technicians, ordinary men caught in a geopolitical vice, and the sight of the world's most famous fighter standing in that dismal basement felt like a hallucination born of sheer desperation. Ali stood before them, his hands shaking visibly and his head tilted as he absorbed the sight of their hollowed faces and stained clothing. The silence in the room was heavy with the realization that their lives were no longer abstract numbers on a diplomatic cable, but a visceral, breathing reality. Ali felt the immense weight of their collective hope pressing against his chest, a burden more profound than any championship pressure he had ever navigated in the ring. He looked at each man, making eye contact that bridged the gap between a global icon and a forgotten captive, communicating a shared humanity that bypassed the need for a common language. The guards stood back, their rifles lowered, but their eyes wary, sensing the shift in the atmosphere as the champion's presence filled the cramped space. In the surveillance room, the dictator studied the flickering black and white images on the screens, observing the way Ali reached out with a trembling hand to touch the shoulder of a man who had collapsed in tears. There was no artifice in the gesture, no awareness of a camera or a political audience, only the raw instinct of a man who viewed the suffering of others as his own. Saddam saw the way the hostages gathered around Ali, drawn to the flickering flame of his resolve, as if he were the only source of warmth in a frozen world. Ali stood among them, not as a savior from above, but as a brother in the struggle, his own physical frailty making his presence even more powerful. He understood in that moment that his mission had evolved from a diplomatic request into a sacred pact that he could never break. The walls of the palace basement seemed to shrink as the gravity of the promise settled into the hearts of everyone present. The hostages clung to his words of silent comfort, their spirits flickering back to life as they realized that the man who had fought the greatest giants on Earth was now fighting for them. The monitors captured every nuance of the interaction, the way Ali's jaw set with a grim determination, and the way his eyes never wavered from the task at hand. It was a display of moral courage that defied the cynical logic of the regime, a moment of pure conviction that unsettled the observers in the control room. The guards shifted uncomfortably, feeling like intruders in a space that had suddenly become a sanctuary of hope. Ali stayed with them until the guards signaled that the time was up. But as he was led back toward the elevator, he carried the image of those 15 faces etched into his mind. The point of no return had been crossed with a quiet finality that left no room for compromise or retreat. He knew that the next time he spoke to the dictator, it would be with the strength of 15 souls behind him, and the palace would have to decide if it was ready to face the world after breaking a promise made by the greatest. The elevator doors closed, leaving the basement in a renewed silence, but the spark that Ali had brought into the darkness remained, a small but inextinguishable light in the heart of the enemy's stronghold. He prepared himself for the final confrontation, his heart beating with a steady, rhythmic pulse that signaled the start of the last and most important round of his life. Every tremor in his body now felt like a drumbeat of purpose, driving him back toward the throne room where the ultimate decision awaited. The sincerity he had shown was a currency the regime did not know how to devalue, and as the lift ascended toward the light, Ali felt the power of his commitment crystallizing into an immovable force that would either break the doors of the prison or bury him within them. Final. Saddam announced, "I am giving them to you." 15 Americans boarded the plane together with Ali. In the sky over Iraq, there was total uncertainty, as at any moment they could have been shot down by an accidental missile. When the plane crossed the border, the hostages began to sob and hug Ali. He returned to America. There were no medals from the government, only 15 saved lives. Ali proved that even when the body fails, the spirit can win a fight that all the world's armies had lost. The hum of the jet engines felt like a low, rhythmic pulse as the aircraft climbed through the thick, hazy atmosphere above Baghdad. Inside the cabin, the air was heavy with a mixture of disbelief and the lingering scent of desert dust. Ali sat by a window, his hands resting on his knees, the tremors still present, but somehow secondary to the immense stillness that had settled over him. He watched the sprawling beige landscape of Iraq shrink beneath the wings, knowing that they were flying through one of the most dangerous airspaces on the planet. Every slight lurch of the plane or change in engine pitch caused a ripple of tension among the men who had spent weeks in darkness, their eyes darting toward the small windows as if expecting to see the smoke trail of an incoming projectile. The Iraqi military kept a silent watch from the ground, and for a terrifying duration, the passengers remained suspended in a geopolitical limbo where their lives were still subject to the whims of a regime that could change its mind with a single radio command. Ali did not speak, his presence alone serving as a quiet anchor for the group. He had spent his final energy in the palace, and now he was simply a passenger in a vessel of reclaimed hope. The silence of the cabin was eventually broken not by an explosion, but by the pilot's voice crackling over the intercom, announcing that they had officially cleared Iraqi airspace. In that instant, the dam of suppressed emotion finally broke. The 15 men, who had maintained a stoic mask of survival for so long, collapsed into each other's arms. They reached out to touch Ali's shoulders and hands, their tears falling freely onto the fabric of his suit. He accepted their gratitude with a humble nod, his tired eyes reflecting a deep, soulful peace. He was a man who had been stripped of his physical crown years ago, yet in this high-altitude sanctuary, he held a title that no commission could ever revoke. The journey across the ocean was long and quiet, a slow transition back to a world that had largely written him off as a relic of the past. When the wheels finally touched down on American soil, there were no grand ceremonies waiting on the tarmac, and no official delegations from the administration that had discouraged his trip. The media coverage was fleeting, overshadowed by the drums of the approaching Gulf War. Ali simply walked away from the terminal, fading back into the private struggle of his health, carrying no trophies other than the knowledge that 15 families were whole again, because he had dared to show up when others stayed away. He had walked into the heart of a dictatorship with nothing but his reputation, and left with a victory that defied the logic of force. His body continued its slow decline, the tremors a constant companion, but the legend of Baghdad remained a testament to a power that did not require speed or strength. He had shown the world that true greatness was not found in the ability to avoid suffering, but in the willingness to carry the suffering of others. As the years passed, the memory of that flight remained a quiet beacon of what is possible when a single human being refuses to accept the inevitability of conflict. Ali had finished his greatest fight, not in a ring under bright lights, but in a distant palace and a crowded plain, proving forever that the heart is the only weapon that never misses its mark.